As we go into dorsiflexion, we would keep the toes tucked in, so go into adduction, and then we could go into plantar flexion and splay the toes by going into abduction. And while we are resting, let's continue with our nerve gliding exercise demonstration. And this is the final one. This is the 50th nerve gliding exercise demonstration, and it is going to be to release tension on the lateral plantar nerve. A few days ago, I showed you how to perform the prone lateral plantar nerve tension test. This exercise, if that test was positive, is going to greatly help at alleviating your symptoms. With regard to the actual exercise, we're going to be in a standing position, and we could be propped up against the wall, holding onto a chair. I've got the massage table already set up. So I'm just going to be propped up against the massage table. There are two components to this one. The first thing that we want to do is we are going to go ahead and go into dorsiflexion of the ankle. We want the hip, knee, and the ankle to start in neutral, and then go into dorsiflexion for 3 to 5 repetitions. And then we want to check in with ourselves and ask ourselves, have my symptoms gotten better, worse, or have they stayed the same? If we notice that our symptoms have either gotten worse or they've stayed the same, we would immediately stop with the exercise. There is no need to continue because we don't want to exacerbate your symptoms. However, if your symptoms have immediately improved, what we would do is perform 20 additional repetitions of ankle dorsiflexion. Now, let's say you do the ankle dorsiflexion and you haven't noticed a reproduction of your symptoms. We would build tension on the nerve by splaying the toes. We're going to go into abduction of the toes, abduction away from the midline by splaying the toes. So we want to maintain that dorsiflexion and then separate those toes 3 to 5 repetitions. After 3 to 5 repetitions, once again, we are going to ask ourselves, are my symptoms getting better, worse, or are they staying the same? If you notice that your symptoms are either getting worse or staying the same, we would immediately stop with the exercise because there's no need to continue. We don't want to exacerbate your symptoms. However, if your symptoms have immediately improved, we would maintain that dorsiflexion and go into abduction of the toes, abduction, splay those toes for 20 additional repetitions. That's if we want to work proximal to distal and a little bit more statically. If we want to work a little bit more dynamically and also play around with building tension at one end and releasing tension at the other end, we could also do opposite motions at each end. Here's what I mean by that. This exercise has two components. We have the dorsiflexion component and we have the splaying of the toes or the abduction component. When we go into dorsiflexion, we place the proximal attachment under tension. When we go into abduction of the toes or splaying the toes, we place the distal attachment under tension. So if we wanted to alternate, what we could do is as we go into dorsiflexion, we would keep the toes tucked in, so go into adduction, and then we could go into plantar flexion and splay the toes by going into abduction. So when we go into dorsiflexion and adduction by closing the toes, we're creating tension at the proximal attachment and slack at the distal attachment. When we splay the toes and go into plantar flexion, we are creating slack at the proximal attachment and we are going to be creating a little bit of tension at the distal attachment. So that is how we get a little bit more of a gliding motion. So we go into dorsiflexion with adduction and then we go into plantar flexion with abduction. So we're doing that motion with our ankle and our toes. And then those are a few different ways in which we could play around with the exercise to help release tension on the lateral plantar nerve. If you have any type of issues with the lateral plantar nerve, if you tested positive on the prone lateral plantar nerve tension test, or if you have typical symptoms like any type of pain in the lateral sole of the foot or any type of tingling in the smaller toes, that is when we would perform this exercise. But that is the 50th and final nerve gliding exercise demonstration. Tomorrow, I'm going to be showing you guys 27 different Aldoas to release tension on the different nerve roots, depending on which nerve root is affected, to also help with your neurological symptoms. So check out for that tomorrow. We got 27 Aldoas coming up, but right now, our rest period is up. It is time for the 10th and final set. That was just a tiny taste of what can be found in my members only section. If you enjoyed it, become a member for only $5 a month to get access to hundreds of member only videos.